Hello. It is time for us to continue where we stopped, and from this day on, we will be going through anatomy and physiology of digestive system or alimentary tract, if you want to call it like that. Uh, Before I started recording it, I did have quite a bit of dilemma as how to present it. What is the best way of doing it? Should we split it first, doing anatomy and then followed by physiology? But somehow I was under impression that putting it into a nice palatable mix, anatomy immediately followed or topped up with the physiology of different parts of digestive system might be the best approach that we can have for now. So let's see how it's going to work. And if it doesn't work, we can always revert back to old style anatomy first, physiology second. And I will try to make as many recordings as needed, trying to keep the ones that are posted as short as they can be, and also to be stopped pretty much where it's a logical moment for us to make a pause before moving on. Anyway, so enough about this introduction as what we need to do. Let's rather do it. And let me share the screen with you where I prepared a bit of a slideshow for us to go through. And as you can see on the title, we're talking about anatomy and physiology of digestive or alimentary system. Assuming that you are a newcomer into this area, I'd rather use this composite image and introduce the entire system so that you have at least that kind of big picture presentation. Where do we start? Where do we end? And what are the steps that we have to go through? Basically, our digestive or alimentary system is the one which starts in part of the head, particularly with oral cavity or mouth. We're going to do anatomy of this part of the body, and we will address associated structures to oral cavities such as salivary glands. We're going to spend some time talking about the tongue, about teeth, before we move away through fauces into part of the body that we should know from earlier days from the respiratory system, and that is, of course, the pharynx. That is an interesting part because it is an organ that is evenly shared between digestive and respiratory tracts, never together. It's either or. And of course, at the inferior end of the pharynx, should we decide not to go into direction of larynx and trachea, basically there will be a seamless transition between pharynx and esophagus, a muscular tube that'll continue descending through the thoracic cavity, find its appropriate opening through the diaphragm. And the very last part of the esophagus is going to be called the abdominal esophagus because technically it's going to be placed within the abdominal space. Abdomen itself, perhaps the most densely populated area of the body, as you can see, is going to be hosting pretty much 90% of structures that fit into digestive system. So as we follow the passage of food from mouth into pharynx, esophagus, of course, the next step has to be the stomach, a little bit of a naturally created container or reservoir, which allows us to have significant fluid and food intake over a relatively short period of time. From stomach, the content will be gradually released into first the small intestine, composed of three different parts: the duodenum, the jejunum, the ileum. It is quite a long segment of the digestive tube. Small intestine becomes continuous with a large intestine consisting of cecum, ascending colon, transverse colon, descending colon, sigmoid colon, and finally a rectum that terminates with anal canal and anal opening. Basically, if you follow this part of the presentation, you'd realize we're talking about hollow tubular structures pretty much since we enter the region of pharynx, and that is truly why we can call it a digestive tube. However, you can immediately think and keep asking yourself, did we forget something? Yes, we did. Not that we forgot it, we just left it for this moment. Digestive system, of course, would not be as functional as it is without addition of two extremely important organs to the list of structures. One of them is liver, together with its gallbladder, which stores and concentrates the bile. And the other one, naturally, is the pancreas, which produces also quite copious pancreatic juice secretion, which includes pancreatic enzymes, but also very importantly, it produces secretion that is alkaline, which is immediately offsetting acidic content coming out from stomach. Both liver and pancreas are frequently referred to as accessory organs to digestive tract. I don't like so much this term accessory because it means like something that is there, but push comes to shove, we can do it without it. But I rather call them affiliated or associated organs of the digestive system because truly without liver, gallbladder, pancreas, digestive system would be heavily crippled and it won't be able to function and operate the way we know it and the way it should be done. All right, so if this was good enough for introductory part to digestive system, let's reiterate that most of it, practically of its, let's say, in average adult person's 7-8 meter long digestive tube, is there something that we can say is a common denominator? And answer, of course, is, as many of us are expecting, yes, there is something that they have in common. And that's why for the next couple of minutes, we will stay here on this slide presenting 4 different layers that the digestive tube is made of. As you can see, they're named inside out direction: mucosa, submucosa, muscularis, and serosa. About each of these 4 layers, we do have a responsibility to say at least a couple of words, and the way they are illustrated on this slide is exactly the same order that we will apply. So let's go and let's explore mucosa, the innermost layer of the digestive tube. Certainly, tube is hollow, and its central part, now illustrated as being empty without content, is what we refer to as the lumen. Next to the lumen comes the first layer that is part of mucosa, and of course that is the epithelium. The epithelial cells that are found within digestive tube are those ones that are highly specialized in order to do absorption of nutrients. So not only that the lumen is going to be thrown into multiple epithelial folds in order to increase the absorptive surface, but also the epithelial cells that are making these folds are going to have plenty of hair-like projections on their apical parts that are called cilia and not cilia, villi and microvilli. They are going to increase 100-fold absorptive surface of the digestive tube, and we're talking about at least in excess of 2, maybe even 300 square meters. So we're talking nearly about 3,000 square feet of absorptive surface. That is what mucosa is the most important for. As you know, mucosa, of course, cannot sustain itself without supporting connective tissue, lamina propria, which actually feeds the epithelial cells. We remember that epithelia do not have direct blood supply, so they have to be fed indirectly. And through the lamina propria, you can see here that there are some secretory ducts of minor glands associated with a mucosa or submucosa. However, there is something else also that deserves our attention. It is, as indicated here, green colored structure named mucosa-associated lymphatic tissue. In short, we call it MALT, M-A-L-T. What is that? Basically, they are lymphatic tissues, organs, something that would be quite comparable to, let's say, our tonsils. Perhaps the tonsils are a very good example of what mucosa-associated lymphatic tissue is, with the difference that tonsils actually could be seen as they sit inside the oral cavity. And as we know, lymphatic system is almost equivalent of what our immune system is. So exposure of different microorganisms and their antigens that could lead to direct activation of mucosa-associated lymphatic tissue, triggering immune reactions, is actually the protective part that the tube itself would have. Certainly, lots of mucosa-associated lymphatic tissue will be seen at the most common entry point, that is mouth or the oral cavity, where we have two palatine tonsils, we have lingual tonsil, we have even pharyngeal tonsil, practically tonsils that are going to be the first line of defense if any microorganism or any kind of antigenic activity is detected. Later on, within the rest of the tube, sporadic appearance of smaller lymphatic nodules as illustrated. However, in the last part of the small intestine, the ileum, there will be increased number of MALTs, so-called Peyer's patches, and also it's going to be in the appendix part, which is attached to the cecum. Basically, appendix also contains large number of mucosa-associated lymphatic tissue structures. That is the reason for which appendix frequently could get inflamed, and if appendicitis is encountered, basically it might trigger a need for having appendix surgically removed. But that is the whole point of MALT, to act as our defensive mechanism. Finally, the third part of the mucosa is its own muscular layer. Fairly thin, but it's still there. It's called the muscularis mucosae. The muscles of the mucous layer are going to contract and relax, practically changing geography, changing the folding, increasing and decreasing number of folds within the mucosa. That would be pretty much a direct response to whether there is a content and lots of nutrients that we have to slow down in order to absorb, or with a less relaxation, it will smoothen out mucosa as the layer. We're coming now to the second layer that is called the submucosa. Based on the color, I think that right away you can say, yeah, I think this is really like plenty of loose connective tissue, and your conclusion is absolutely right. Also, you can see the increased presence of blood vessels, both arterials as well as veins. Arterial and venule are possibly the best words to use to find them within the submucosa layer. You can see also like acini of different glands that are also inside the submucosa, so their secretory ducts are going to go from submucosa through mucosa into lumen. And let's not forget submucosal plexus or plexus of Meissner. Basically, that is a conglomerate of nerve fibers that are given a little bit of autonomy to our digestive tube. Because we know it's quite long, so we're talking about perhaps the length that exceeds easily 8-9 meters in average adult person. So when we consume food and we swallow it, it goes down to stomach. From stomach, it becomes released into small intestine. And as the small intestine slowly propels the content in order to ensure that there is plenty of time for absorption of all the nutrients, basically it has to be done with a certain control. And that kind of control that controls secretion of different glands, presence of more or less folds of the mucosa. That is all due to submucosal plexus of nerves or plexus of Meissner. So we're going into the third layer, which is Now, muscularis. Please don't mix it up with the muscularis mucosa. This is just muscularis. Typically, throughout the tube, we're going to see two layers of muscles. Most of them are smooth muscle fibers. The inner layer is arranging muscular fibers in a circular form, while the outer layer allows muscle fibers to run longitudinally. So, hence the circular and longitudinal muscle layers. The only exception to this setup is a stomach where we're going to have third obliquely running layer of muscle fibers within its walls. That is what makes the stomach being quite unique. However, longitudinal and circular muscles in the rest of the gut are going to be sufficient muscular force to create and to carry the peristaltic wave that will be consisting of certain segments of the gut being constricted while the distal part is still relaxed. So it'll create this kind of wave-like moment, propelling the content gradually throughout the digestive tube. And of course, there will be plenty of nerve fibers that are controlling the muscularis. It's another plexus, which is called the myenteric plexus or plexus of Auerbach. So with Auerbach's plexus and Meissner's plexus, now we can say basically that is what makes so-called the enteric nervous system. This enteros is a Greek word practically denoting digestive tube. So enteric nervous system is the nervous system belonging to digestive tube, which operates practically on its own, being subject to some kind of additional tweaks coming from autonomic nervous system, whether it's sympathetic or parasympathetic division. But most of the work digestive tube can do on its own, which regulates motility, which regulates secretion, which regulates release of enzymes based on the quality and quantity of food that we have consumed. Finally, to wrap it up, we need to place the last outermost coat, which is known as the serosa, which also has a little bit of its own loose areolar connective tissue, and then the epithelial layer, which is something that just wraps up the entire tube. However, if you follow the epithelium and you come to upper right corner of this screen, you're going to find out it's not called any longer epithelium. Now it's renamed the mesentery. We're to spend a little bit of time explaining what the mesentery and what the peritoneum is, but for me, it is imperative that you see something else. Regardless of what we're going to call it, mesentery or epithelium, if we follow this layer of epithelium, it's obviously going to go this way. It'll go all around the digestive tube, come to the opposite side, and as we follow it, it is going to look like it's going where it came from. Essentially, basically, the serosa is the outermost layer that covers the tube, but between its two layers that are forming the mesentery, the physical structure that holds the digestive tube suspended from the abdominal wall, we have a little bit of a space filled up with loose areolar connective tissue, and through this space, basically major blood vessels, whether they're arteries or veins, are able to access the tube, because we know without cardiovascular system being used as a conveying belt, all the nutrients that we absorb actually will have to figure out some other form of transportation. But with blood vessels coming in and going out from the gut quite freely, that problem has been resolved. Of course, this model of 4 layers cannot be applied to pancreas, cannot be applied to liver, because simply these are different organs. They are not tubes, they are solid organs, and their function is to support the digestive system with their own secretion. So during this presentation, you and I will anyway come to the liver and pancreas and explain the most important things that are happening within these 2 organs. Now, I suggest that we can move a little bit further, and it's really hard for us to just jump into abdomen open it up and say that's where we find the digestive tract. So let's spend here just a couple of minutes talking about the abdomen and muscles that are making abdominal wall. Being as large as it is, practically the largest body cavity, containing so many different organs, perhaps the best way to do is to try to make it a little bit easier to handle, and perhaps something that we can point out here on this diagram in the upper right corner. Mid-sagittal plane will be used and will split the abdomen to left and right. And then the plane that runs through the umbilicus, the transumbilical plane, will help us physically divide the abdominal space into right and left upper, and then right and left lower quadrants. Here you have the list of different structures and organs that are found within individual quadrants. Occasionally, we would need a different geography to apply. So if we use the hypochondriac plane that runs through the lowest parts of the thoracic cage, transtubercular plane running through tubercles of the hip bone, and then mid-clavicular planes, basically the abdomen could be now divided into not 4, but rather 9 different regions: right, left hypochondriac, right, left lumbar, right and left inguinal region, epigastric, umbilical, hypogastric region, and so on. So that's effectively an easy way to go through the abdomen to try to divide it into smaller and much easier to handle regions. One thing that you may have also started thinking about is what exactly makes the walls of the abdominal space. The previous diagram was not showing too many of the bony features, but if we just go quickly backwards and we outline the lowest part of the thorax and uppermost part of the pelvis, we have a huge area, which is practically to be covered and to make a wall of muscles. So when cross-section is done through the abdominal cavity, basically we're now trying to look at this diagram from 2 different directions. First one is that I want to introduce the concept of how multiple muscles build the abdominal wall. And second thing is also to show you the space that we have practically when body walls are formed. Interestingly, we can do this. Anterior and lateral part of the abdomen is going to be more difficult for us to grasp. As you can see, there are 3 different muscles. I will try to mark them with numbers 1, 2, and 3, going from inside out: transversus abdominis, internal oblique, and external oblique muscle being the outermost. These 3 muscles are seen both on the left and right side, and they overlap each other, practically making most of the lateral and good part of the anterior abdominal wall. On the anterior abdominal wall, we have 2 muscles running parallel next to each other. That is a rectus abdominis. Basically, in a colloquial form, people know what rectus abdominis is, but they call it 6-pack muscle. Essentially, there are 2 3-packs, so to say, because there was left and right rectus abdominis. So with 3 flat muscles, transversus abdominis, internal and external oblique, their tendons do not stop when they reach the lateral boundary of rectus abdominis. Instead, their tendons continue going around rectus muscles, going superficial and deep to it, practically making in the center, in the midline between left and right rectus muscles, basically dense, thick, white connective line, which is given exactly that name, linea line alba, which means white. That linea alba becomes the major connection point between left and right-sided muscles of the anterior and lateral abdominal wall. On the back side, posterior abdominal wall is much easier, as we have first, a very much smaller gap between rib 12 and the uppermost part of the pelvis, and lumbar vertebrae are going to be there to make significant part of the wall. Next to lumbar vertebrae, we're going to have two muscles that are also big. One of them is psoas major, the one which I'm marking currently with the letter X. And next to it, quadratus lumborum, another smaller X that I'm placing on the left and right side of quadratus lumborum muscles. So essentially, 6 different muscles with a little bit of skeletal help is going to be good enough for us to assemble the wall of the abdominal cavity. Now, the space itself appears to be quite large, as it is. And on this diagram, you see a couple of structures that are left in place for us to grasp another concept. So if you follow what I'm going to do now with my cursor and go all around this diagram, I will tell you what I'm doing right now. I'm outlining the layer which is called peritoneum, serous membrane that is lining the walls of the abdominal cavity, and also it covers surface of certain abdominal organs, but not all of them. The best equivalent would be if you go back and think about pleura. We know what pleura has done for the thorax was parietal layer to line the walls of the thoracic cavity, including upper surface of the diaphragm, and then its quick move over to the root of the lung until it finally starts covering the lung surface, turning itself into a visceral layer of the pleura. Abdomen is going to have the same concept, parietal and visceral peritoneum, whereas multiple organs that reside inside the abdominal cavity will have some of their surface or majority of their surface covered with peritoneum, the visceral one. This diagram illustrates what we have here. This is the right side of the body. So this is A for ascending colon. This is B, or we can put D for descending colon. And now you can see that I already had this part of peritoneum covering part of the surface of both ascending and descending colon. Part, but not all of it. That's why for these two segments of the large intestine, we can say that they sit behind peritoneum. They are extra peritoneal, or maybe the best word, retroperitoneal. Retro means behind peritoneum. However, this is part of the small intestine, and as you can see, nearly all of its surface is wrapped up with parietal peritoneum. Almost all of it. That is why for this organ that I'm marking currently with an arrow, we will say that it is intraperitoneal structure. And this segment of 2 layers of peritoneum being so close next to each other actually forms the mesentery. It is derivative of peritoneum with a specific aim and specific goal to hold suspended long segment of the small intestine from the posterior abdominal wall. Don't worry, it's not so complicated. We just have to find the different diagrams, and we're going to have some of them soon. This was just to remind you of complexity of the situation that we will experience inside the abdomen before we can move on. So another quick view to muscles that are forming anterior and lateral abdominal wall. This time we're going to start with rectus abdominis, left and right, with its tendinous intersections, making it look like six-pack. And of course, in between left and right rectus muscles, there is a combined thick linea alba into which other flat abdominal wall muscles insert. Going this time from outside in direction, first muscle is called the external oblique. Then deep to it sits the internal oblique muscle. Finally, deepest of the three flat muscles is the transversus abdominis. And the reason why you see the diagrams left versus right side a little different is that they actually removed on the right side of the screen the rectus sheath. On the left side, it has been preserved. Basically, what you see here is a cut end of multiple flat muscles and their tendons. As they wrap up the rectus abdominis, some of the fibers will go anterior to it, some of the fibers will go posterior or deep to rectus muscle, and they would form the rectus sheath. So that is what you see as a little difference between left and right side of the diagram. When anterior and lateral abdominal wall muscles are removed, basically you can have here a little bit of a view as what the quadratus lumborum would look like. Psoas major would sit here in the area that I'm currently adding a little bit of extra color. It has been removed. Psoas major is also a very significant muscle to make the abdominal wall, posterior part of it, but perhaps you would remember it as most significant, strongest flexor of the hip muscle. All right, so this is how the linea alba is formed. Now you can see three muscles, deepest, middle, most superficial. It's flat aponeurotic tendons as they approach the lateral edge of the rectus abdominis, and then they start moving either superficial to rectus or deep to rectus. As they surround the muscle, they form the rectus sheath, and they do not end abruptly at the midline. Fibers coming from, let's say, left side, reach the midline and continue over to the right. Fibers from the right side, they also reach the midline and continue further to the left. So by doing this, as what I'm showing now with my fingers that are doing excessive overlap with each other, we actually create a very strong bond in the form of linea alba between left and right-sided muscles, and that is what ensures the integrity of the anterior abdominal wall. One more time, same idea, just a different diagram for you. If you want to stop here and take another look, please do so. This is quite nicely illustrating how the rectus sheath is formed, how some fibers go deep, some of them go superficial, but ultimately the rectus sheath must be formed. So after the abdominal wall, we're going to go into very unique form of description of what is a peritoneum and what is then the peritoneal cavity. We're going to inevitably include some of the organs of the abdominal cavity, but we're not going to throw all of them at once. So let's go and let's see what awaits for us here. I always like to start from this direction. Mid-sagittal plane section is illustrated. You have multiple intra-abdominal organs, such as liver, such as stomach, such as pancreas, such as multiple coils of the small intestine. You even have here urinary bladder. You even have here part of the rectum and anal canal. So you have a chance to kind of see quite a large number of different things, but not in that kind of dense and heavily populated form as more accurate images would do. Let's not forget, we also have here, I will mark it with a circle to make it more visible, part of the large intestine, which is called the transverse colon, while these little circles actually show coils of the small intestine. So I'm not going to do it with lots of different precision techniques, but I just want you to see it. whichever way you go over blue or red or green shaded area, you can start outlining it with a straight line, and you're always going to come to exact same point where you started. Whether you're going to do it in blue, in green, or red, it's up to you. So essentially, what this diagram illustrates is not necessarily what the legend is pointing out, suprainfracolic compartment or omental bursa. I use it just to show you the continuity between peritoneal layers. If I do it here, let's go and say this is part of parietal peritoneum covering the posterior abdominal wall. Then it has to go off and away from the abdominal wall and keep moving towards multiple coils of the small intestine, going back and forth. However, you realize that it's still the same uninterrupted red line, which I'm drawing in front of your eyes. And when I come back here, back to the posterior abdominal wall, basically now I can almost apply color to structure that I surrounded with a red ink and point to you. This is, guys, the mesentery. We form derivative of peritoneum by letting it go off the abdominal wall, through it, reaching the coils of small intestine, surrounding them, and then going back. The mesentery, as I mentioned it today a couple of times, is basically holding suspended the longest segment of the digestive tube from the posterior abdominal wall. But how about duodenum, and how about pancreas? What about them? Well, obviously, only part of their surface is in a very light touch covered with peritoneum. They are not intraperitoneal. They sit behind the peritoneum, so pancreas and duodenum are extra or retroperitoneal structures. That is the main purpose and main objective of this diagram, to look at this from this direction. Basically, to clarify what is supra and infracolic compartment, the whole peritoneal space with a transverse column running from left to right becomes physically divided into supra and infracolic part, superior and inferior to transverse column. The blue-colored omental bursa is practically one enclosed part of the peritoneum, practically like a bubble, but don't worry, it does have its access, entry and exit point at the same time, so it's not something that has no beginning, no end. It is just a compartment or a segment of the peritoneal space, which is deep to the stomach or posterior to the stomach, and it is called the omental bursa, or it is named as the lesser sac. Move on to the next picture. The next one basically identifies all of these things from the previous slide with perhaps a little bit more detail. Same color code is applied, suprainfracolic compartment and bursa or lesser sac. This is its exact opening slash exit, and you have the same structures. The difference between diagram A and B is practically just highlighting what's happening with peritoneal cavity during a lifetime. Diagram A shows it earlier in life during the fetal stage of development, and now you can see how the blue color extends further inferior to the stomach from this point on all the way down. And that is getting into part of the peritoneum that's called greater omentum. Later in life, in adulthood, obviously that space becomes completely obliterated. There would be no more blue-colored area in the greater omentum. Practically, it has been completely resorbed, and the lesser sac or omental bursa is now reduced to a much smaller space, which sits mostly behind the stomach. We're still looking at different images, trying to illustrate, trying to give us a little bit better orientation what is the peritoneum and how complicated it is. On the left side of the screen, you actually have this line here, very irregularly shaped and looking quite awkward, obviously heading towards the beginning of the large intestine, towards cecum, starting here at the duodenum. Basically, that's the root of the mesentery that I just highlighted for you. Of course, when we cut it at the posterior abdominal wall, together with the cut part of mesentery, we're actually removing the entire small intestine minus duodenum, which is retroperitoneal. Another thing that is done here, we have a bit of transverse colon also removed from here to here. And now you can see the peritoneal derivative, which looks like it's hanging suspended from the transverse part of the colon. That segment of peritoneum is actually what we call the greater omentum. Greater omentum. Lacy apron is another colloquial name that people use. Now, liver is here, stomach is here, pancreas is hidden because it's retroperitoneal. And if we take a quick look on the right side of the screen, basically some of these things are kind of confirmed. That is pancreas. This is duodenum. That is definitely a retroperitoneal, so we don't see it here. And now what we see hanging from the transverse column going all the way down, and it looks like going up to reach stomach. That is the greater omentum. Well, that just adds to more and more complexity. You realize how simpler situation we've seen in a thoracic cavity. It was just parietal, visceral, pleura, one single fold allowing parietal to turn into visceral or the other way around. But in the abdomen, peritoneum was way, way, way busier and created a number of different derivatives. And here is what we already know about it. One of the derivatives is the mesentery. And we know it is going to be holding suspended pretty much the entire small intestine minus duodenum. There's another part which we did not mention. It's the transverse mesocolon. Meso refers to mesentery of the transverse colon, another derivative. Okay, here's the greater omentum. We already know a little bit about it, practically sitting suspended or attached to the transverse colon, going all the way down and then folding up to reach the stomach. That's the greater omentum. Where's the lesser omentum? Here it is. If there is a greater, there has to be a lesser omentum. Another little derivative which connects the underside of the liver to the lesser curvature of the stomach. If we want to just quickly check something else, and we go to the lower part of the abdominal wall, then we go over symphysis pubis, over the upper surface of the urinary bladder, around uterus, then back from the posterior surface of uterus onto rectum and back to the posterior abdominal wall. Basically, these structures, whether it's rectum, uterus, vagina, urinary bladder, urethra, these are all extraperitoneal structures. They do not have large percentage of their surface wrapped up with the peritoneum. They are considered to be extraperitoneal, just as the pancreas. Only the anterior surface of the pancreas, the one which I highlight, is in touch with the peritoneum. It's less than 50%. But if you take a look at the stomach, this is the posterior surface of the stomach. This is anterior surface of the stomach. So practically in excess of 95% covered with the peritoneum. Stomach is intraperitoneal organ. Liver is intraperitoneal organ. Jejunum or ileum are intraperitoneal. Duodenum is extraperitoneal. Pancreas is also extraperitoneal. Picture doesn't illustrate kidneys, adrenal glands, but they are extraperitoneal. And this is aorta. It is also extraperitoneal structure. Now, from the anterior direction, this is what the greater omentum looks like. It is called lacy apron, and it really is yellowish because it contains lots of adipose tissue and blood vessels. The adipose tissue is there in the case of some people who appear to be quite lean, not having enough of adipose tissue under their skin. Basically, the adipose tissue in the greater omentum is acting as a thermal barrier, preventing any kind of excessive loss of heat through the abdominal wall. So it safeguards us. Another fold that peritoneum has to do by passing from abdominal wall onto liver is creating what we see in adult anatomy and call it the falciform ligament. It is duplication of peritoneum that is connecting the underside of the diaphragm with diaphragmatic upper surface of the liver, and it holds liver practically suspended in the upper right quadrant. Otherwise, liver, which is as big and as heavy as 2 kilograms on average under the gravity, would have no incentive really to stay in the uppermost part of the abdomen. Liver, just for the record, is also intraperitoneal organ, and the falciform ligament is one of the structures that are holding it in place. Another diagram, and I know that this is slowly becoming a bit too much, but sometimes one diagram actually is very much pleasing our eyes, and for somebody else, that diagram makes no sense. So I'm giving you here several diagrams. You find the one which you like the most and perhaps try to stop and use it while you're studying this part. I wanted to do this. This is the lesser curvature of the stomach, and this is the greater curvature of the stomach. So from the greater curvature of the stomach comes greater omentum. It goes down, and then before reaching the level of pelvis, it makes U-turn, and it keeps going up and back to reattach on the anterior surface of the transverse colon. That is greater omentum. Lesser curvature of the stomach with underside of the liver is connected with lesser omentum. When in place, you would not be able to see aorta because it's also not transparent, thin membrane. But what is really important that lesser omentum contains blood vessels that are important to reach the liver, and also the lesser omentum contains part of the biliary duct, ensuring that the bile from liver and from gallbladder would be able to reach the small intestine, practically the duodenum. Few more images, again, just for your own value. If you like them, use them. If not, just keep moving on. This illustrates what the lesser omentum is underside of the liver versus lesser curvature of the stomach. Now you can see the entire large intestine ascending, transverse, descending, and sigmoid column. And in the middle, of course, multiple coils of small intestine, ileum, and jejunum. When the greater omentum is lifted up, basically, we are now seeing a little bit closer what the mesentery looks like. And we also see the mesocolon part, which is suspending the transverse colon from the posterior abdominal wall. This here is descending colon. It is already retroperitoneal, so it was ascending colon on the right side of the abdomen. Lesser omentum once again, mesentery with a greater omentum, very similar diagram, so nothing to add, just trying to find image which works best for you. And perhaps this one is also good because on the diagram marked C, you have the greater omentum in place. Because of greater omentum going from a greater curvature of the stomach, you do not see the rest of the abdominal cavity content. When the greater omentum is removed and liver is lifted up, it reveals a little bit more directly what the lesser omentum looks like, and it reveals different parts of the small as well as large intestine. And finally, diagram E with mesentery in place perhaps will do a little bit of extra value for you to absorb, to digest, and to process the information we just shared. If you're thinking about supra and infracolic compartment, this picture could be of some value. This is the transverse colon, which has its own mesentery, that is the green colored part attached to it. It's the mesocolon transversum. So practically anything above would be supracolic, and this inferior to the transverse colon and its mesentery is the infracolic compartment. In order to wrap this one up and not to leave it with a little bit of a rough situation with the peritoneum, I believe that we can just say what are the functions that the digestive system has to fulfill. There are 6 of them, and I believe that most of them are kind of self-explanatory. The journey definitely starts with food ingestion. Foods, solids, liquids, they have to be ingested by entering the oral cavity or mouth. Even inside the oral cavity, we know that there is some kind of secretion that's happening. Mostly it would be due to saliva production and salivary glands, but there would be some kind of secretion of enzymes, perhaps coming from the surface of the tongue, but that enzyme is not necessarily right away splitting larger molecules. Saliva also contains salivary amylase, and it starts splitting also larger molecules of carbohydrates. Secretion will certainly continue with the stomach secretion. It has to secrete acid, liver, producing bile, pancreas producing its pancreatic secretion, pancreatic juice, pancreatic enzymes, but also the digestive tube will keep secreting, diluting its content to ensure quicker, faster, and more accurate absorption. Third function is propulsion. As we know, food which enters the oral cavity is chemically processed with saliva, but it's very insufficient and insignificant. Most of it, it's mechanical form of digestion by chewing food and mixing it with saliva. So food enters the oral cavity, but what goes out of it is already given a different name. We call it bolus. A bolus is mixture of ingredients that we ingested, mixing them up with the saliva, practically pulverizing it and making it easy for us to swallow without fear of bolus getting stuck either in pharynx or esophagus. Bolus enters the stomach, and with stomach secretion, which is quite copious, adding quite a large volume of fluid, then the content of the stomach is not even bolus any longer. We start calling it chyme. And the chyme keeps traveling from stomach into small intestine, into large intestine, being subject to absorption of nutrients, water, soluble vitamins, minerals, and ultimately reaching the end stage where it turns into fecal mass and becomes eliminated from a digestive tract. So propulsion is ability of the digestive tube to generate this kind of sine wave contraction or relaxation, which is called the peristalsis, in order to make actively food bolus chyme moving through the system. Digestion, whether it is mechanical or chemical, mechanical, we know it's chewing. Digestion is use of enzymes and splitting larger organic molecules into smaller base building blocks, those ones that are so small that they can allow us that digestion simply overflows into phase number 5, which is absorption of nutrients. And lastly, but of course not the least important, is the elimination of waste products from the digestive tube. At this point, I'm just going to stop here because the next section is going to be a little bit more about the oral cavity, about teeth, about tongue. And I believe that for now, this is going to be long enough to make it one post on my channel for you to see it. And I will continue these days. And as the new parts are coming in, they will be posted for you. I hope you're going to like them. I hope that there will be something educational. Please follow me on my YouTube channel. And until next video, have a great day and enjoy. Thanks for watching this one. Bye-bye.